Chapter 10, Part 3. Habits of Labor. Second Annual Message. Utica Convention. Fifth Avenue Conference. Views of Civil Service Reform. Nominated for the presidency. The governor's faith in his constituents proved not to have been excessive nor misplaced. At the election held on the 2nd of November, the state ticket identified with his policy was elected over a coalition of its adversaries by majorities ranging from 15 to 20,000. The moral of this triumph was the more impressive, as New York was the only state at this election in which the Democratic Party had made a distinct issue on administrative reform, a distinct issue in favor of a sound currency, including a repeal of the Legal Tender Act, and a distinct issue against third-term candidates for the presidency. It also revealed the numerical weakness of the Canal Ring, which concentrated all its energies that were available without bolting the ticket to defeat it. This triumph of Mr. Tilden's friends gave him a prominence throughout the country enjoyed by no other man in his party. By it all eyes were immediately turned upon him as the natural, the inevitable, candidate of his party for the presidency. He incarnated administrative reform, the great, controlling, pressing need of the country. As Judge Blair expressed it, he seemed to be the only arrow in the Democratic quiver. He was not merely a friend of reform, he had fought its fight, and won. He had the baptism of fire and blood. He had behind him a state possessing an eighth of the population of the whole Union and more than half its wealth, a stainless reputation, unsurpassed experience as a statesman, and the record of a life largely devoted to the unsullied service of the public, compromised neither by greed of office nor abuse of power. He was now in the 62nd year of his age, 5 feet 10 inches in height, of what physiologists call the purely nervous temperament, with its usual accompaniment of a spare figure, blue eyes, and fair complexion. His hair, originally chestnut, was partially silvered with age. His head was large, and in its shape, recalled to the most casual observer the circular form and well-rounded proportions so much admired in the typical head of the Caesars. His health, unfortunately, was not as firm as his will. He paid little attention to the monitions of nature, and never allowed them to interfere with his work. It never seemed to occur to him in those days that however intemperately he labored, his strength and reserve would ever be less than at the moment he was drawing upon it. If there be any truth in the old proverb that a man is his own physician or a fool at 40, Tilden was a fool, for I never met a man of average intelligence who had reached Mr. Tilden's age with a feebler comprehension of human physiology, or of the elementary laws of health. During the whole of his first winter in Albany he permitted nothing to distract him by day nor long by night from his public cares, and when for social or other reasons his labors were interrupted, which he permitted rarely, his face would pale, his eyes become lustreless, and he would exhibit the expressionless features and exhausted air of a man pining in vain for sleep. He was then, as he had been ever since he came to the bar, if not before, an intemperate tea-bibber, which was the immediate cause of another pernicious habit, that of resuming work immediately after leaving the table. Indeed, his mental strain was only partially interrupted while eating, for his table was constantly frequented by his lieutenants and other public men, who did not permit his mind to be diverted, even at his meals, from his official preoccupations. When remonstrated with for this persistent disregard of his health, his habitual reply was, in substance, "I cannot help it. This work must be done." It was vain to tell him that the pitcher might go once too often to the cistern, that when he had broken down his constitution, and his doctors had sent him to his bed or his grave, this answer would not avail him. Unhappily, it rarely avails any one, so prone are we all to exaggerate our individual importance in operating the machinery of Providence. As he worked himself and denied himself, he could see no good reason why his clerks and others about him in the government should not work and deny themselves in the same relentless way. He had no more patience with a statesman than with a soldier who paused in a battle to save his life. In the spring of 1875 he became very impatient with what he deemed the dilatoriness of one of the counsel employed in prosecuting the suits then pending in New York against Tweed's Confederates, and sent for him to come to Albany to be scolded. The counsel in question, who had been anything but dilatory, waited upon the governor and ventured to conclude his defense with the unfortunate remark that he could not afford to neglect his private business entirely. "When you accepted this retainer," said Tilden sharply, "you said you would not permit your private business to interfere with it." The counsel then muttered something deprecatingly about not wishing to appear at the bar as a man with one client or of one idea. "Sir," exclaimed the governor fiercely, "a man who is not a monomaniac is not worth a damn." Only a day or two before Mr. Bryant was to visit him, in February 1875, he experienced a cerebral attack which was so near akin to paralysis as to alarm his friends, and to occasion the rumor to be current that he was mentally a wreck. Thurlow Weed said to a Democratic friend the following day, "Did you know that Tilden had broken down?" "Yes," he added, "broken down deplorably. His mind all gone. His friends are in consternation. He drinks, they say, dreadfully, and neglects his business." In this way, and through such channels, a temporary illness was erroneously explained and grossly exaggerated, doubtless from partisan motives. But there is little doubt that from this illness, the result of overworking his brain, dated the gradual physical decline which terminated 11 years later with his life. When the governor met the legislature on the 4th of January, 1876, the financial condition of the country was excessively depressed. The kinds of business that were carried on at a profit were few in number. Labor found scanty employment at reduced wages, and for the first time in our history the unemployed and those who thought their labor inadequately remunerated held public meetings in our larger cities with the view of ameliorating their condition. Many investments had ceased to be productive, and many kinds of property, through shrinkage or loss of circulatory character, had ceased to be available for the payment of debts or as mothers of credit. To account for this state of things, and to point out the mode by which the general paralysis of the business of the country could be remedied, was the most striking feature of Governor Tilden's second annual message. It was an admirable paper, a paper which time has not staled, and which constitutes an enduring chapter in the science of statesmanship. The peculiar advantages which the state of New York possesses among the great political communities of the earth were never better stated than in the 3 or 4 of the preliminary paragraphs of this document. It was early discovered that New York possessed within her territory the natural passes of military operations, which, in the wars for colonial existence and for national independence, cross-tracked our soil with fire and blood. Our territory was also found, on the later development of the national growth, to occupy the natural thoroughfares of travel and traffic. It touches the ocean with a harbor ever open, accessible, and safe, close by whose gates the ocean currents compel to pass nearly all transatlantic navigation to and from this country. It connects that harbor and the tranquil Hudson on the north with Lake Champlain and the Canadas, and on the west, by a level crossing the bases of the mountain ranges that traverse the continent, with Lake Erie and its chain of great inland seas, bordered by rising commonwealths which are the marvels of modern times. We are, with our fellow citizens of other states, joint inheritors of a system of government, the selected product of the oldest existing civilization, formed according to the best ideas evolved from human experience, but freed from the overgrowth of habits and interests elsewhere incident to such experience, and planted in the virgin soil of an unoccupied continent, abounding in all the gifts of nature. Our population, by the census just taken, is near 4¾ millions. Our annual product of agriculture is still greater than that of any of our young rivals, whom we contemplate with admiring pride as in part the creations of our policy and the swarming homes of our own children. Our domestic manufactures are larger than those of any other state. Our foreign commerce is 1½ that of all the rest of the Union. Common schools, in which are taught 1 million of youths, and seminaries of higher learning, are training our successors to improve on whatever they can inherit from the present generation. Institutions of charity dispense everywhere their benefactions, and the surface of our whole domain is dotted thickly by edifices whose spires point to heaven. If, on this fair picture, there are spots that indicate a recent prevalence of private waste or folly, or that disclose evils or wrongs by government, resulting in much temporary distress, let us remember with humility that we have been in part the authors of what we deplore, or, at least, consenting witnesses, and let us be grateful that we can reform what is amiss, and that to our hands, under God, is committed our own future. The governor then proceeds to point out extravagances to be discouraged and economies to be made in various departments of the government, chiefly in the management of the canals. In ordinary legislation, he says, it is stretching the function of the executive veto too far to apply it to every case in which the governor, if a member of the Senate or Assembly, would vote against a bill. There seems to be a disposition to hold the executive to the extreme of accountability and respect to appropriations. This tendency may be carried so far as to disturb the constitutional equilibrium of the executive and legislative forces. Not desiring to amplify my official powers, nor disposed to shrink from any just responsibility, the occasion seems fit to invite a frank understanding, to avow my own wish for, and to seek from you a cordial cooperation on this subject for the good of our common constituents. Such are the motives he assigns for setting forth at length his views of the financial condition, prospects, and possibilities of the state, in plain language divested of the technical terms of complicated accounts. It was in this delicate way that the governor sought to convey a gentle warning to the legislature not to waste its time nor his in concocting predatory schemes, which were sure to receive their quietus in the executive chamber. His strictures upon the past extravagance of the government in its eleemous innery structures are striking, and unhappily time has not yet robbed them of any of their pertinence. After directing attention to 4 such institutions, 3 asylums and 1 reformatory, then in process of construction, which had already cost the state $3,300,547.79, and which would probably cost more than as much again to complete, he proceeds. It might have been supposed that such an extensive provision for the insane as is contemplated in these 3 institutions, the asylums for the insane, could not become necessary on the instant, and that common prudence would have dictated that one institution should be completed before another was begun. But unfortunately, not even the sacred influences of charity could save these works from the spirit of legislative log-rolling, or the rapacity of local expenditure. The policy of beginning everything and finishing nothing has prevailed. He then adds, it is quite clear that an outlay of $5,000 per inmate, for the purpose of providing shelter for the unfortunate objects of public charity, is unreasonable and extravagant. That would be equal to $25,000 for 5 persons, which compose the average family in the state. How many families of laborious and thrifty producers can afford to live in a house costing $25,000? In 1865, less than 1/60th of the houses of this state were of stone, and their value was about $10,000 each, or $2,000 for each inmate. Those of brick, which are about 1/8 of the whole number, were valued at $6,000, or $1,200 for each inmate. Those of wood, which are 3/4 of the whole number, were valued at $1,100, or $220 for each inmate. I deny that there is any sound public policy in erecting palaces for criminals, for paupers, or for the insane. A style of architecture simple, and fitted to the nature of its object, would reconcile artistic taste with justice toward the industrious producers, on whom falls the burden of providing for the unfortunate. Waste in such edifices is not only a wrong to the taxpayers, but by just so much it consumes the fund which the state is able to provide for the objects of its charity. Nor does the mischief stop with the completion of costly dwellings. The state still has to provide annually for the support of their inmates. By an inevitable association of ideas in men's minds, magnificent homes lead to magnificent current expenditure. The pride of officers and managers, and of local admirers, and the zeal of benevolence, are freely indulged where they are gratified without expense to those who are swayed by them. It is to be remembered that, after all, the burden of taxation is chiefly not upon accumulated wealth, but upon the current earnings of the million who carry on their productive industries in frugal homes. They ought not to be the only class disfavored by the policy of the state. The portion of the message of most enduring interest and value, perhaps, relates to the financiering of the federal government. For making systems of taxation and expenditure at Washington the theme of nearly one-half of his address to the state legislature, his excuse was that New York's own share of the taxes levied by the federal government annually exceeded $80 million, that the federal government controlled the currency and banking of the whole country, was the principal dealer in precious metals, regulates the supply and rates of the loan market, the terms of our foreign exchanges, the prices of exports and imports, the quality of our circulating medium, and in addition to this exerts a natural and powerful ascendancy over public opinion through its peculiar and exclusive means of propagating ideas in sympathy with the methods according to which its own operations are conducted. The governor's suggestions for a prompt resumption of specie payments seem as simple now as the discovery of America would appear to one of our accomplished transatlantic skippers, but when promulgated they provoked as much mistrust and flippant criticism as the plan of Columbus for finding a western path to the Indies encountered from the Spanish courtiers, and from much the same class of minds. After 11 years of convulsion without a restoration of specie payments, it now claims a restoration of specie payments without a convulsion. The problem does not seem difficult. Resumption by the government will accomplish completely resumption by the banks. The Treasury has only, by gradual and prudent measures, to provide for the payment of such portion of the outstanding Treasury notes as the public, not wishing to retain for use, will return upon it for redemption. The sum required in coin, if the preparations be wisely conducted so as to secure public confidence, will be what is necessary to replace the fractional currency and to supply such individuals as prefer coin to paper for their little stores of money, and also what is necessary to constitute a central reservoir of reserves against the fluctuations of international balances and for the banks to amass a sufficient quantity by intercepting from the current of precious metals flowing out of this country, and by acquiring from the stocks which exist abroad without disturbing the equilibrium of foreign money markets, is a result to be worked out by a study of all the conditions, and the elements to fulfill those conditions, and by the execution of the plan adopted, with practical skill and judgment. Redemption, beyond this provision of coin, can be effected as other business payments are effected, or in any method which converts investments without interest to investments upon interest, on terms the holder will accept, and by such measures as would keep the aggregate amount of the currency self-adjusting during all the process, without creating, at any time, an artificial scarcity, and without exciting the public imagination with alarm which impairs confidence, contracts the whole large machinery of credit, and disturbs the natural operations of business. The best resource for redemption is that furnished by public economies, for it creates no new charge upon the people, and a stronger public credit is certain to result from sounder finance, and will reduce the annual cost of the national debt. These opinions, deduced from reason, are confirmed, in a recent example, by experience. France, in her 10 months contest with Germany, incurred a war expenditure of $1,000 million in specie values, and in the 28 months following the peace, paid an indemnity of $1,000 million in specie, or its equivalent, to a foreign country. These great operations were carried on without causing a depreciation of the currency beyond 2.5%, at its extreme point, and without disturbing the general business or industry of the people. But the governor was not content with providing remedies for the evils from which the people were suffering in their business and industries merely. They must be broader and deeper, he said. What is more needed now is that the public mind be reassured by a wise, safe, and healing policy. The dread of imaginary evils ascribed to the methods assumed to be necessary to restore specie payments is more mischievous than the reality, wisely pursued, ought to be. As soon as the apprehension of an impending fall of values is removed, manufacturing and mechanical industries will start anew. Dealers will buy for future consumption. Enterprises that commend themselves to the sober judgment of investors will be undertaken. And capital, which now accepts any low rate of interest where there is no risk, but is withheld from operations of average character, will be lent on reasonable conditions. But the remedies for the evils now felt by the people in their business and industries must extend beyond any measures merely relating to the currency. They must be broader and deeper. They must begin with a prompt and large reduction in governmental expenditures and taxation, which shall leave in the hands that turn it a larger share of the result of labor. They must proceed by withdrawing, as much as possible, governmental interferences that cripple the industries of the people. They must be consummated with an increased efficiency and economy in the conduct of business and in the processes of production, and by a more rigorous frugality in private consumption. A period of self-denial will replace what has been wasted. We must build up a new prosperity upon the old foundations of American self-government, carry back our political systems toward the ideals of their authors, make governmental institutions simple, frugal, meddling little with the private concerns of individuals, aiming at fraternity among ourselves and peace abroad, and trusting to the people to work out their own prosperity and happiness. All the elements of national growth and private felicity exist in our country in an abundance which Providence has vouchsafed to no other people. What we need to do is to rescue them from governmental folly and rapacity. Again he says, when governments take from the people for official expenditure nearly all the surplus earnings of individuals, science and skill in the art of taxation become necessary to preserve and enlarge the revenue, necessary to gild the infliction to the taxpayers. Our present situation is that we have more than European burdens, as seen in the most costly governments of the richest of modern nations supporting immense navies and armies and public debts. And to these burdens we have conjoined an ignorance and incompetency in dealing with them, which is peculiarly our own. We have not yet acquired the arts belonging to a system which the founders of American government warned us against, and fondly believed would never exist in this country. The consequence is that the pecuniary sacrifices of the people are not to be measured by the receipts into the treasury. They are vastly greater. A tax that starts in its career by disturbing the natural courses of private industry and impairing the productive power of labor, and then comes to the consumer, distended by profits of successive intermediaries, and by insurance against the risks of a fickle or uncertain governmental policy and of a fluctuating governmental standard of value, blights human well-being at every step. When it reaches the hapless child of toil, who buys his bread by the single loaf and his fuel by the basket, it devours his earnings and inflicts starvation. Another evil of such a system of excessive taxation is that it creates and nourishes a governmental class with tendencies to lessen services and to enlarge compensation, to multiply retainers, to invent jobs, and foster all forms of expenditure, tendencies unrestrained by the watchful eye and firm hand of personal interest, which alone enable private business to be carried on successfully. In other countries, such a class has found itself able, sometimes by its own influence and sometimes in alliance with the army, to rule the unorganized masses. In our country it has become a great power, acting on the elections by all the methods of organization, of propagating opinion, of influence, and of corruption. The system, like every living thing, struggles to perpetuate its own existence. Every useful and necessary governmental service, at a proper cost, is productive labor. Every excess beyond that, so far as it is saved by the official, merely transfers to him what belongs to the people. So far as such excess is consumed, it is a waste of capital, as absolute as if wheat of equal value were destroyed by fire, or gold were sunk in the ocean. Probably such waste by governmental expenditure in the 11 years since the war amounts to, at least, as much as our present national debt. The prominence which Tilden had already acquired as a candidate for the presidency gave a purely political tone to the legislation of this session. Each party was fighting for position. It was with anything but complacency that the presidential aspirants of his own party, among whom Hendricks, of Indiana, Thurman and Allen, of Ohio, Bayard, of Delaware, Hancock, of Pennsylvania, Parker, of New Jersey, and Church, of New York, were conspicuous witness to his growing favor with the country. Their discontent was more or less disclosed at the Utica Convention, at which delegates were chosen to attend the National Convention that was to nominate a president at St. Louis on the 26th of June. Relying upon the community of interest and sympathy of the predatory class who had felt the weight of the governor's heavy hand, they sought to prevent the expression at Utica of a preference for his nomination, so that the delegates might be left free and accessible to such influences as competing candidates might be willing and able to bring to bear upon them. It was unsuccessful, however. The earnest friends of the governor in the convention were in an irresistible majority. His friends constituted a large majority of the delegation to St. Louis, and to guard against any treachery on the part of the disaffected delegates, the following resolution was adopted. Footnotes. As early as the 26th of May, the following article, understood to be from the pen of the late William C. Bryant, appeared in the leading column of the Evening Post, a Republican print, and reflects very correctly the impression left upon the minds of considerate and dispassionate parties by the conduct of those Democrats who were arrayed against Mr. Tilden. The Democratic schism that recently developed opposition to Governor Tilden in his own party in this state is curiously significant of certain things which are worthy of careful study, and especially worthy of consideration by honest and sincere Democrats outside of New York. There are two wings, so to speak, in that party, and Governor Tilden represents one of them, while the persons who oppose him constitute the other. It is natural enough that the Canal Ring and its followers, Tammany and its adherents, and that sort of Democrats who are commonly called Bourbons, should labor to defeat the nomination for high office of the man who represents everything that they oppose, and opposes everything that they represent. But it will be a most discouraging thing to every person who hopes for good at the hands of the Democratic Party, and every man in that party who sincerely seeks to make it the instrument of governmental purification and a return to sound principles and honest methods, if such opposition is permitted to prevail in its councils. Governor Tilden represents all that there is in the Democratic Party which the people are at all disposed to trust. His opponents represent that which the people just now most earnestly dread, and the development of the opposition in these circumstances affords that party a precious opportunity to strengthen itself and win some of that popular confidence which it badly needs, by placing itself fairly upon the side of the right. It will not be easy to close the breach which exists in the Democratic Party in this state, for the reason that it is never easy to reconcile an honest desire to do right with a set purpose to do wrong, and it will be difficult to arrange a compromise which shall not seem to be a mere bargain. Governor Tilden has fought manfully for hard money and honest government. It is impossible to mistake his attitude on these questions, and if at this juncture the party yields to the demands of the men in New York who oppose him, it can scarcely hope to escape the reputation of having rejected those principles and written hostility to them upon its banners, whatever clever devices it may hit upon for concealing the fact under formal declarations of doctrine. His name has been put forward too far to be withdrawn now without a practical declaration of hostility to the principles which his name has come to represent. The country is asking the question, can we trust the Democratic Party? and it will take its answer, very probably, from the temper with which the party in other states shall deal with the schism here. The case is a very peculiar one. There are other Democrats in plenty who believe in the doctrines which this particular Democrat holds to be primary principles, but he has managed to make himself the especial representative and equivalent of those principles in that party, as no other man has. He has put his principles in practice in the most fearless and resolute manner, and has made himself especially obnoxious to their opponents, as the hostility to him, of which we write, clearly shows. And the consequence is that, rightly or wrongly, the country is disposed to regard his acceptance or rejection as the head of the party in the nation as an answer to its question concerning the trustworthiness of democratic professions of honesty and sincerity. End footnotes. Start story again with 2 short sentences in case you, the listener, lost your place. The earnest friends of the governor in the convention were in an irresistible majority. His friends constituted a large majority of the delegation to St. Louis, and to guard against any treachery on the part of the disaffected delegates, the following resolution was adopted. The Democratic Party of New York renew their fidelity to the principles set forth in their platform adopted in 1874 and 1875, thrice approved at the ballot boxes of the Empire State, well vindicated in the illustrious administration of Gov. Samuel J. Tilden, and commended anew to their faith and adoption by the endorsement of an increasing majority of their fellow Democrats of sister states throughout the Union. The Democratic Party of New York re-adopt also their resolution adopted in the state conventions of 1864, 1868, and 1872, to wit. Resolved that the delegates to the Democratic National Convention to be appointed are hereby instructed to enter that convention as a unit, and act and vote as a unit, in accordance with the will of a majority of the members thereon. And in case any of its members shall be appointed a delegate thereof by another organization, and should not forthwith in writing decline such appointment, his seat shall be regarded as vacated, and the delegates shall proceed to fill the same. And it is hereby also empowered to supply all vacancies by death, absence, resignation, or otherwise. The Democratic Party of New York, while committing to their delegates the duty of joining with the delegates of their fellow Democrats of all the states in the momentous deliberations of the National Convention, declare their settled conviction that a return to the constitutional principles, the frugal expenditure, and the administrative purity of the founders of the Republic, the first and most imperious necessity of the times, the commanding issue now before the people of the Union. And they suggest, with respectful deference to their brethren of other states, and with a cordial appreciation of other renowned Democratic statesmen, faithful, like him, to their political principles and public trusts, that the nomination of Samuel J. Tilden to the office of President would ensure the vote of New York, and would be approved throughout the Union, as the recognition of this supreme necessity, the incarnation of this vital issue, the pledge of our high purpose, and the guarantee of a successful achievement of this arduous work of national regeneration and reform. These resolutions were adopted unanimously, and without a single protest or word of dissent, a circumstance which disarmed the opponents of Mr. Tilden in the delegation, when they came to declare war upon him at St. Louis, on the 16th and 17th of May of this year, and only a few weeks before the meeting of the Utica Convention. A memorable conference of more or less conspicuous citizens of New York City, most of them Republicans, was held at the Fifth Avenue Hotel, for the ostensible purpose of organizing a movement for the purification of the federal government, and to that end preventing, if possible, the nomination of Blaine, Conkling, or Morton, or any of the political staff of General Grant, for the presidency. The following gentlemen figured conspicuously in this conference: Theodore Woolsey, who was elected president; William C. Bryant, Professors Seelye and Sumner, Parke Godwin, Carl Schurz, Horace White, David O. Wells, Peter Cooper, Governor Bullock. In all there were 170 persons enrolled among the conferees. In an address which was adopted by the conference, and which Carl Schurz is generally understood to have written, they thus define the political situation with which they propose to deal. A national election is approaching under circumstances of peculiar significance. Never before in our history has the public mind been so profoundly agitated by an apprehension of the dangers arising from the prevalence of corrupt tendencies and practices in our political life, and never has there been greater reason for it. We will not display here in detail the distressing catalogue of the disclosures which for several years have followed one another in rapid succession, and seem to have left scarcely a single sphere of our political life untouched. The records of courts, of state legislatures, and of the National Congress speak with terrible plainness, and still they are adding to the scandalous exhibition. Our republic, but a century old, and just issued from the only great civil conflict we have had to deplore, is so strong in resources and organization that it stands in the foremost rank of the great powers of the earth. And yet, with all these splendid results on record, it cannot be denied that at no period during the century now behind us, the American people have been less satisfied with themselves, and that the centennial anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, in so many respects to all Americans a day of sincerest pride and rejoicing, is felt to be in other respects not without self-reproach and humiliation. Of this the corruption revealed in our political life is the cause. And this is the way the conferees decided to deal with it. We therefore declare, and call upon all good citizens to join us in it, that at the coming presidential election we shall support no candidate who, in public position, ever countenanced corrupt practices or combinations, or impeded their exposure and punishment, or opposed necessary measures of reform. We shall support no candidate who, while possessing official influence and power, has failed to use his opportunities in exposing and correcting abuses coming within the reach of his observation, but for personal reasons and party ends has permitted them to fester on. For such men may be counted on not to uncover and crush corruption, but for the party's sake ready to conceal it. We shall support no candidate, however conspicuous his position or brilliant his ability, in whom the impulses of the party manager have shown themselves predominant over those of the reformer, for he will be inclined to continue the fundamental abuse, the employment of the government service as a machinery for personal or party ends. We shall support no candidate who, however favorably judged by his nearest friends, is not publicly known to possess those qualities of mind and character which the stern task of genuine reform requires. For the American people cannot now afford to risk the future of the Republic in experiments on merely supposed virtue or rumored ability to be trusted on the strength of private recommendation. In one word, at present no candidate should be held entitled to the support of patriotic citizens of whom the question may be fairly asked: is he really the man to carry through a thoroughgoing reform of the government? Can he with certainty be depended upon to possess the moral courage and sturdy resolution to grapple with abuses which have acquired the strength of established custom, and to this end firmly to resist the pressure even of his party friends? Whenever there is room for such a question and doubt as to the answer, the candidate should be considered unfit for this emergency. Every American citizen who has the future of the Republic and the national honor sincerely at heart should solemnly resolve that the country must have a president whose name is already a watchword of reform, whose capacity and courage for the work are matters of record rather than of promise, who will restore the simplicity, independence, and rectitude of the early administrations, and whose life will be a guarantee of his fidelity and fitness. A man at the mere sound of whose name even the most disheartened will take new courage, and all mankind will say, "The Americans are indeed in earnest to restore the ancient purity of the government." The first 3 paragraphs of this eloquent manifesto, said a member of the conference, were intended to guard against the nomination of that class of aspirers to the highest office which was aptly represented by Messrs. Blaine, Conkling, and Morton of Indiana, and the remaining paragraphs were expressly written and were understood to cover such mere makeshifts as Messrs. Hayes and Hartranft, one or the other of whom it was feared might be brought forward at the last moment as a compromise, and for the defeat of the friends of reform. I need hardly say that these ringing sentences, as they were read to the conference by Mr. Schurz, were received and adopted in the sense here given them, amid the most tumultuous plaudits and congratulations. Each man, as he heard the sentences, made the applications and cheered anew. Hayes, who was thus indirectly denounced by the Fifth Avenue conferees as unfitted for the presidency, and who was a guarantee for no one of the reforms which they made conditions of their support, was, however, nominated by the Republicans at Cincinnati on the 14th of June, and the convention was organized in the interests of Mr. Blaine, who was by far the most popular name presented to it. Throughout the balloting, seriously smirched as he was by the recent publications of his overtures to jobbery, Blaine continued the leading candidate. Mr. Bristow, who, because of his courageous onslaught upon the whiskey ring, had become the standard-bearer of the reformers, received only at the highest 126 votes out of 756. The adherents of Blaine, Conkling, and Morton were largely in the ascendant, and might at any time have determined the result, but they could not agree in their personal preferences. After 7 ballotings, at the instance of a prominent politician of Pennsylvania, Mr. Hayes, of Ohio, whose only votes have been those of his own state, and of a few stragglers, 68 in all, received the nomination. Of these conferees the most significant and important figure, though not the most conspicuous, was our most eminent American poet, William Cullen Bryant, the venerable editor of the New York Evening Post, and a lifelong friend of Tilden. When in 1874 I suggested to him the probability of Tilden's nomination for governor that fall, he promptly said, "I hope he will get the nomination. If he does, I shall vote for him." I have no doubt he did vote for him. Unhappily he did not possess a controlling interest in the paper, his partner, Isaac Henderson, holding an equal interest with himself, which had its influence, no doubt, in preventing the Evening Post from openly supporting the candidature of Mr. Tilden. He gave directions, however, that nothing hostile to Mr. Tilden should appear in its columns, a direction which was probably repeated during Mr. Tilden's canvass for the presidency, when the like forbearance was strictly observed in its columns. In view of his well-known respect and esteem for Mr. Tilden, I felt myself justified in addressing him the following letter. J. Bigelow to William Cullen Bryant. Albany, August 27, 1876. My dear Mr. Bryant, it has been one of my dreams for several months that your name should head the Tilden electoral ticket this fall for the presidency. It has not been practicable for me to see you since the St. Louis Convention, and I am now obliged to ask the governor's secretary, Mr. Newell, to do me the favor to convey to you the expression of my sincere hope that if named as an elector you will not decline. You need not be told how gratifying such a nomination would be to Governor Tilden, nor need I recapitulate to you the many obvious reasons why you should desire to oblige his friends, a large proportion of whom are your pupils, with the use of your name. The course of the Evening Post, of course, somewhat disappoints me and others who, like me, embarked in this effort at administrative reform for no mere personal ends. To all such it would be an unspeakable satisfaction to know that you would not decline to charge yourself with the duty of taking their vote to Washington and depositing it for the candidates who in their judgment represent the best hope of the country. Let me pray that if the convention which is to meet on Wednesday next should desire, you will not pain your friends by refusing them and your country this service. I remain, as ever, my dear Mr. Bryant, very sincerely yours, John Bigelow. To this letter I received by the hand of my messenger the following reply. Cummington, Mass. August 28, 1878. My dear Mr. Bigelow, your letter of yesterday, which has just been put into my hands, was an utter surprise to me. There are many reasons why I must decline allowing my name to be placed on the Tilden electoral ticket, some of which you will, I think, understand without my referring to them. Others relate to the character and composition of the two political parties in the field, and to the letters of acceptance written by the two candidates for the presidency. Such as they are, they constrain me with a force which I cannot resist to decline acting on the suggestions made in your letter. It gives me great pain to refuse anything to the friends of a man whom I esteem and honor as I do Mr. Tilden, whom I know to be so highly accomplished for the most eminent political stations, whose opinions of the proper province and objects of legislation and government have been formed in the same school as my own, and who, so far as he is not obstructed by the party to which he belongs, will, I am sure, act not only with ability and integrity, but with wisdom, in any post to which the voice of his countrymen may call him. I am, dear sir, faithfully yours, W.C. Bryant. Honorable John Bigelow. The tenor of this letter was more of a surprise than a disappointment. That Bryant recognized Mr. Tilden's superior fitness for the presidency I did not doubt. That he should have attached undue importance to the difference in tone of the declarations of the two conventions on the subject of the civil service was the less surprising, as he was not aware that the only faithful and genuine civil service which had been attempted in the whole country up to that time was then on exhibition at Albany under the governor's auspices and patronage. It became the duty of the Secretary of State to digest the state census of 1875. That officer applied to General Walker, who had been superintendent of the federal census of 1870 and a Republican, to suggest to him the name of some competent person whom he had trained to take a similar position at Albany. He named Colonel C.W. Seaton, also a Republican, who was immediately appointed. An average of about 80 clerks was required to assist him in his work. He was instructed at once by the Secretary of State to prepare a series of tests adapted to the service required and to advertise for candidates. This was done. All the candidates were subjected to the same tests, and from them Mr. Seaton, and he alone, selected his quota of assistants. No candidate was questioned as to his politics, and it subsequently transpired that a large majority were Republicans. Mr. Bryant lived to see how little the declarations of the Cincinnati Convention had to do with the reform of the civil service, and how soon all the desirable patronage of the federal government was employed to defeat the wishes of the people and to place in the presidential chair a candidate they had not elected. It is but just to the memory of Mr. Bryant to say that, though his paper lent a formal support to the Republican candidate, which he could not have prevented, if he would, he did not vote for him. The Democratic National Convention met at St. Louis on the 27th of June. Henry Watterson, of Kentucky, was elected temporary chairman, and General John McClernand, of Illinois, permanent chairman, both earnest friends of Governor Tilden. An informal ballot disclosed such a decided partiality for Mr. Tilden that he was nominated on the second ballot by the following vote. Whole vote 738. Necessary for a choice, 2/3 of 492. Samuel J. Tilden, of New York, 535. Thomas A. Hendricks, of Indiana 60. William Allen, of Ohio 54. Joel Parker, of New Jersey 18. Winfield Scott Hancock, of Pennsylvania, 59. Thomas F. Bayard, of Delaware 11. Allen G. Thurman, of Ohio 2. Footnote. Among Mr. Tilden's papers were found some notes dictated by Mr. Tilden to accompany certain extracts from the letters of President Jefferson, in which we have a glimpse of some of his views of civil service reform. These extracts from Mr. Jefferson's letters do not embrace all the cases in which changes are confessedly necessary. 1. Confidential offices which powerfully affect the action of the chief executive must be filled by persons in cordial harmony. 2. Offices that have been filled in violation of civil service principles may be changed without violating those principles. Offices conferred on the spoils system, without reference to the competency or fitness of the incumbents, are not required by civil service principles to remain with the abuses uncorrected. 3. Experience has shown that in all trusts where the abuse is not restrained by the vigilant and firm supervision of the proprietor having an interest in the maintaining of economy, a tendency exists to the useless multiplication of subordinates. Every officer, after a little time, wants a waiter, and by that waiter himself wants a waiter. Everybody deputes his duties to an inferior, and withdraws himself into a mere superintendence of the underling. And then, while subordinates are appointed to oblige members of Congress or other prominent persons, the whole drift is to a creation of more offices. The distension to which the public service has grown is enormous and incredible. How can these excrescences be lopped off without changing the head? A glance at the Blue Book will amaze anyone who is not acquainted with that astonishing record. End footnote. End chapter 10 part 3.